Hello and welcome to our presentation, Building Your UC Splunk Arsenal for Threat Hunting and Security Analysis. My name is Edward Wade, and my coworker Elliot Pfarr will be presenting after me. We are security analysts for the Sherlock division at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. And Sherlock Cloud is a secure multi-tenant managed cloud platform that meets the FISMA, HIPAA, and NIST CUI requirements. We host for a number of academic industries, including the UC Office of the President. Elliot and I work on the Splunk platform at Sherlock, and between the two of us, we have about a decade of Splunk experience. Elliot has worked as a SOC analyst, and he has offensive-defensive certifications. And my background is network security administration, and I hold a number of vendor certifications as well. So outlining our presentation, we're going to talk to you about building an infrastructure. Using Splunk for security use cases, we're going to go over some definitions and hardware requirements to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're going to look at log sources, identifying, gathering, and normalizing these for data model acceleration. And then after that, Elliot will go through and develop threat hunting and analysis capabilities. He will plan security use cases, execute attack scenarios in detail in our sandbox, and then he will go over how to develop analysis capabilities. So Splunk has been considered a SIEM, but it's really a data analytics platform. While it's not specific to security, using Splunk in a security operations center or SOC can provide a single vendor-agnostic tool for use cases such as threat hunting, incident response, and risk analysis. The life cycle for developing a Splunk infrastructure usually begins with collecting the logs, normalizing them, and then providing some type of analysis. Some caveats that I want you to know are there are no two logging infrastructures that are the same. Everything depends ultimately on what you host, the openness of your environment, and the logs that are selected. And no matter what a vendor tells you, you will not find a turnkey solution that satisfies all use cases. These are ever-growing and evolving, and the value is really tied to the work that you put in. In this presentation, we will explain some of the key components to setting up a Splunk infrastructure, and then outline some security use cases that leverage a mature environment. So before I get too far, I want to go over some general definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page with the Splunk terminology. So the Splunk Search Processing Language, or SPL, is the querying language for manipulating and filtering event data. This is proprietary to Splunk, but it's formatted like an interpreter command with pipes to separate out the various filters imposed on the query. Every command is documented in detail in the Splunk search reference, so this is something you definitely want to bookmark because you're going to be going back there over and over again. Splunk has apps and add-ons that integrate with your deployment to add some type of value. Apps tend to focus on GUI interfaces such as dashboards and reports, whereas add-ons, which are typically referred to as technical add-ons or TAs, they tend to focus on getting data in and carving up fields from your event. A knowledge object is a term for any configuration you create in Splunk. We may reference these in the presentation, but they can include things like reports, alerts, a field that is extracted or parsed from a log event, etc. So Splunk Core, previously Splunk Enterprise, is the server version of Splunk. It's an application that runs on a configured operating system that you manage. A Splunk Core server can host a number of roles, so I want to show a diagram of a Splunk environment and how these roles will interoperate. As the searching layer, you have search heads, which is where users interact with the data. This is where they go to build searches for powering alerts, reports, dashboards, and other knowledge objects. Here you have the Splunk indexers, which is where you'll find the raw data, and everything is ultimately sent to the indexers to be cooked and stored, and the search heads then query the indexers for results. In the forwarding layer, you'll find Splunk's Universal Forwarder, which is a light version of Splunk that runs on endpoints, mostly for collecting logs. A forwarder will host TAs, or technical add-ons, that have input configurations. So an example of this would be a forwarder installed on a Windows server with a TA configured to monitor security event logs. And lastly, to manage and maintain all these remote systems and their configurations, Splunk provides a deployment server role, which is essentially configuration management for Splunk. So when it comes to hardware requirements, it's a good idea to overspec. Start with a minimum of 16 cores, 32 gigs of RAM for search heads and indexers. Even if you create a standalone Splunk server for a proof of concept, it's a good idea to start with these specifications because Splunk is a beast. With scheduled and real-time alerts and reports, along with users running queries, it's constantly churning. As your environment grows and matures, you'll often exceed the initial hardware specifications. So if you're working with virtual machines, be prepared to scale resources. If you're using hardware, overspec to accommodate for growth. The indexers and search heads do most of the work, so it's important to monitor the performance of these to make sure you aren't experiencing latency and scheduled searches aren't getting skipped because of high load. Storage speed is also very important to Splunk, specifically the indexers, which perform all the reads and writes of the raw data. So while you can get away with maybe a fast spindle disk, SSDs are almost always required. They're going to make your life a lot easier. The next big step is to identify the log sources of interest. Splunk is often used for security, systems, and network administration use cases, so there's quite a bit of overlap when it comes to identifying useful log sources. It's important to spend a lot of time discovering these use cases to drive the selection process because, as most of us know, logging is not free. Licensing and hardware constraints are always a factor, so it's important to put in the time so you can limit unwanted log collection. There are additional tools to help with this process. For example, when you monitor Windows event logs, you have the ability to blacklist or whitelist using regular expressions, so that's something you want to take advantage of when you're configuring your Splunk inputs. It's also good to know that the Windows and Linux TAs contain many uncommon log inputs. This would be things in addition to the standard event logs and Linux var log files. Things like WMI commands, bash history, modifications to the registry editor hives, or even an interval capture of running processes outputted to Splunk. In addition, you can also create your own custom inputs. The universal forwarder comes bundled with Python, so you can write Python scripts that will generate a log output to be sent over to Splunk indexers. When Splunk receives a log, it assigns a source type to identify the format of that log. After that, fields are parsed based on the source type assigned. Here's a list of source types to give you an idea of the various types of logs you may see in a Splunk environment. An example of this assignment process is when you ingest syslog from a Fortinet firewall. Its traffic logs would have a different format, different fields than its UTM logs, which would be things like IPS, so they would typically get separate source types at ingest, even though they may be coming from the same device and log stream. This parsing and assignment knowledge tends to be created in the TAs, but everything is done in configuration files, so it's very doable to create your own custom source types if you go down the path of developing knowledge objects and TAs for your own log data. So when you go to install your forwarders, don't just click log this, log that, send this here. You need to have a plan for your whole deployment. What you'll be gathering, how, and where it will get sent. Preferably the best approach is you'll install the forwarder and point it to a deployment server, and then don't configure anything else in that forwarder during installation. The rest of the configurations can be sent down by the deployment server. Forwarders will check in, pull configurations to their local directories, and then restart Splunk and run everything in memory. This allows you to standardize and tweak settings in a single location for hundreds of instances. Because everything Splunk does can't be controlled through text-based configuration files, you can technically use any configuration management tool you want. However, the deployment server is free and available, and it makes this process very easy. Once you've identified the logs, it's best to evaluate the methods for ingest. The most common one by far is monitoring log files. This is where you specify an absolute path for a text-based log file to be sent to a Splunk indexer. You can pass parameters such as assigning a source type or an index, but this is ultimately going to be run on a Splunk forwarder and logging a local text-based log file that's running on that machine. The next most common method you'll see is sending a syslog stream to a TCP or UDP input configured on a Splunk indexer. This would be things for like devices like firewalls and switches that aren't able to install the universal forwarder because they're not built on a Windows or Linux OS. Same thing as the monitor log files input, you can assign source type and index, as well as a number of other things that you can see in inputs.conf, but you're going to mostly see this as a method used for sending logs remotely to a Splunk indexer. And the last method is Splunk itself can do API calls against applications to pull logs down into its indexing queue. This would be for things like AWS, Azure, Tenable Security Center. A lot of these open APIs for these applications, they don't have an ability to send logs to Splunk, but Splunk sometimes has tools, usually built in Python, to reach out to those applications, pull what they need and bring it back down into the indexing queue. Even though many of these inputs can be configured in Splunk Web, everything is ultimately saved to a configuration file, in this case the inputs.conf. Splunk provides documentation for all configuration files in the admin manual, and this is an excellent reference to see the capabilities of what you can do when you're configuring one of these inputs. After the data is gathered, it's time to normalize. But I wanted to start with an example that shows the value of normalization. So I want you to consider these destination IP fields. Some firewalls may call it destination underscore IP, some D-IP, and so on, as you can see here. Now imagine all the SPL needed to satisfy all of these field possibilities across dozens of searches against firewall logs. This would be a complete nightmare to manage. If you normalize to a common field, such as dest underscore IP, it makes searching easier and more efficient. Common fields can be expected without having to translate for special use cases. This enables you to perform complex analysis with correlation across multiple source types. And if there's an update to a source log, maybe destination IP becomes destination address, you can fix the way the log gets normalized to dest IP rather than having to update all the SPL queries. Splunk's solution to the normalization problem is the Splunk Common Information Model, or SIM. It provides a defined set of fields for similar events across log sources and vendors. This collection of fields is also called datasets, and they're grouped into what's known as a Splunk data model. These can be thought of as a schema for common IT use cases. So here's an example of an authentication data model and its datasets. The constraints section provides the SPL to filter down the sea of events into only what is applicable for the data model, and in this case, authentication logs. Shown here is the parent dataset, authentication, as it's also called, and its list of normalized fields. The child datasets, such as failed authentication, inherits all fields from the parent and may have additional fields and/or constraints specific to that dataset. So you can see here in this example, an additional constraint is action equals failure to further filter down the results to only failed actions when you're targeting the failed authentication data model. Splunk offers premium apps for getting more out of your data. The Splunk Enterprise Security app provides a security framework for investigation and analysis. IT Service Intelligence is used for IT troubleshooting. And User Behavior Analytics ties together with Enterprise Security for looking at things like user heuristics. The commonality between all these apps is they require compliance with the SIM data models to function. Their knowledge objects are powered by SPL searches targeting the SIM data models, and their accuracy depends on how well those models are implemented. So if you're planning to leverage these apps, it's something you're going to need to address and continually address as you're going through your deployment. To query a dataset, in this example, successful authentication, you can use the data model or from data model commands for generating events. From there, you can pipe to further refine for your use case. Encoded in these commands are the constraints shown here that filter events to the target dataset. It's important to note that all three of these are effectively equivalent. If you pop any one of them into an SPL search, they're going to give you the same output. So typically you'll see these searches at the beginning of a schedule report, alert, or dashboard, but they also work very well for ad hoc querying. I put together a list of some useful data models for security use cases. The one we've been looking at, authentication, can be used to target successful and failed authentication events. Think things like brute force activity. The change data model, which looks at change management events, such as creating users or maybe modifying a firewall rule, that could be used for something like creating a daily report of all the firewall modifications for firewall administrators. And then also you can create your own data model. So the Sherlock team has created the command line data model, which groups together command line logs from various operating systems. So this would be bash history on the Linux side, and on Windows, this would be your process command line when processes are launched. This could be used for things like identifying suspicious behavior through commands, or maybe a frequency of suspicious commands for a particular user. And there are a number of other use cases that target these data models for security analysis, but this is definitely a good short list for building your analysis capabilities and creating some use cases to test against. It's important to understand the value of data models when it comes to correlation. So I want you to consider this use case. Show me all shomes authentication logs, shomes being the account. With the data model search, it's pretty simple. From data model authentication, parent dataset authentication, I'd like to search for user equals shomes. To do something equivalent in a conventional search, it'd be much more difficult. First, I'd have to specify any index because I don't necessarily know what index these alerts are going to be in. And then I could still say user shomes, but then I need to specify the source types explicitly where I want to look for these authentication attempts. I could say source type Cisco ASA, look for ASA action success or failure. I can also look at Linux authentication logs by calling out keywords SSHD, accepted or failed. And then if I want to look at Windows authentication logs, I would have to look at the source WinEventLog security and event code 4624 because that is the event code associated with that authentication. So this is just a small part of what is actually the equivalent search to the top data model search. The problem is we're most likely leaving something out. If all of my logs are SIM compliant, we don't know what else is out there. I could be missing authentication logs from another source type outside of Cisco, Linux, and Windows logs. So this really shows you the power and scalability for data models for a widely dynamic environment in terms of log sources. Accelerating data models is, put simply, a method to speed up data model searching. It runs a standard data model query, parses the fields, but writes the output to summaries stored on your indexers alongside the raw data. So think of data model summaries as like a traditional database table. You have a schema definition with declared values for fields and attributes, and then you have the data model command extracting using this schema and outputting to a table, but excluding the raw data. For each data model, you can specify a relative time range for acceleration, such as build summaries for the last 30 days. These summaries are then updated every 5 minutes, with the front end adding 5 and the back end removing 5 minutes. The tool for querying these summaries is the tstats command, and it requires one or more stats functions, such as the average, count, or sum. And then I'm going to go through the other main components. From clause, which is where you specify the target data model. The where clause is the first opportunity for specifying filters for kind of bringing down your data to a more target set. And then the by clause, this is where the fields you run the stats function against are listed. So I crafted a simple command looking for a count of authentication events by source type, limiting to Windows event logs, and this is what I would expect to see in my output. If I change it to by source type and user, I will get a bigger table outlining the count of events for each user in the WinEventLog source type. And keep in mind, as I've mentioned before, time range and further filtering is also an option to really whittle down for your use case. So, accelerating data model suggestions, and these are mostly in terms of load. Disable acceleration if you don't use it, or in other words, if you don't query that data model. Running acceleration does take resources, so it's something that should be used on a need basis. Also, only enable acceleration on one search head. All these acceleration jobs get queued up from being enabled on a search head, so if you have multiple search heads enabling acceleration for the same data models, you could be duplicating work. Only accelerate to the amount of time you need to query frequently. Remember, even if you don't accelerate for the past month, you can still query data models further back, and that's okay because you may not be querying that very frequently. So as a quick recap, up until this point, we've been focusing on building a Splunk infrastructure, configuring normalized data models that are accelerated for faster searching. So at this point, I would like to pass off to my coworker Elliot to focus on building security use cases using Purple Team exercises, and for configuring Splunk for threat hunting and security analysis based on this mature environment. And with that, I say happy hunting.
Thanks, Ed. Now, the things that Ed has talked about so far apply to any Splunk deployment, any industry that requires crunching logs or data. What defines the type of tool that Splunk is depends on the questions we ask it, the logic behind our searches, and how we leverage it for automation. So for the rest of this presentation, in the context of information security, we're going to review the method that we use to configure Splunk for threat hunting and security analysis. This is an overview of the process that we use to develop our threat hunting capabilities. First, we're going to reference popular attack frameworks to develop security use case scenarios. We'll run attack simulations based on these scenarios in our sandbox environment. We're going to use Splunk to determine our visibility into the attacks. Then we'll identify interesting fields and values, applying search logic to identify those essentially IOCs across all of our detection scenarios. Then we'll have some lessons learned, and it's going to be a rinse-repeat process. We begin our scenarios with some high-level questions. We want to determine our risk via threats and impact. Are we worried about APT groups or the HR rep clicking on malicious attachment? What's our attack surface look like? Do we have any public authentication, websites, VPNs? When we talk about testing these controls in depth, to me that means assuming compromise. What does stage 2, 3, 4 of an attack look like? Because we can't count on detecting that initial compromise or 0 day. A lot of the times we're hoping for these attackers to make mistakes. Finally, we use these scenarios as an opportunity to determine what Splunk should be ingesting versus what logs should be available on the host in case of an IR deep dive analysis. Everyone should familiarize themselves with the Lockheed Martin kill chain and MITRE attack matrix. The Lockheed Martin kill chain is represented by the blue arrow and broken up into 7 different stages of an attack. The MITRE attack matrix is represented by the enterprise attack section, and its focus is post-compromise. MITRE also addresses the recon and weaponization stages with their pre-attack matrix, and we use these matrices to help outline and prioritize the techniques that we'll use during our attack scenarios. And this is a screenshot, just a subset of the MITRE attack matrix. Now, when you review the matrix, I recommend that you start with a tactic. In this case, we'll look at lateral movement, and then we'll focus on prioritizing the simulation of the underlying techniques. In this example, we'll click on pass the hash. MITRE provides us with a short description, some examples of where that technique has been observed, some mitigation and detection techniques that we can apply to our environment via configuration, some which we can directly apply to our Splunk searches. So just a quick tip. If you know which APT group is attacking you, you can take that information to the matrix, look them up, prioritize your detection scenarios based on that APT group's techniques. Now, since we're talking about attack simulations, exploiting vulnerable resources, we need to talk about the environment in which that takes place, our sandbox. Now, for the context of this presentation, our sandbox is going to be a Windows-only environment. It's highly segmented and monitored. We don't recommend that you ingest everything into Splunk, but we do recommend verbosely logging all the things. Ideally, you would duplicate as much from your production environment into the sandbox as possible, but we realize it can be difficult with overhead, maintenance, licensing costs, so we at least recommend using your production SPL to validate your searches, your third-party API integrations, and to save on some licensing. And in general, a sandbox is just a great resource for every InfoSec team to provide labs for research, POCs, demos, and lunch and learns. So what I've done is mapped the MITRE tactics and techniques from the matrix to those relevant to our detection scenarios for the presentation. To keep things simple, I'm just going to skim the surface for each example. In practice, you want to research and test as many of these various techniques as makes sense for your environment. Now, this slide is more of a legend. So continuing on, you're going to see slides with a red ribbon at the bottom. This is going to insinuate the attacker's perspective. We'll also see slides with a blue ribbon insinuating the analyst or blue team perspective. Now, during these blue team slides, the following process is going to be assumed. We're going to identify common fields, values, essentially IOCs. We're going to make sure that they're normalized, SIM compliant, and data model accelerated. And we're going to extract those IOCs from our logs and search them across all of our detection scenarios. Now, I'll describe this process in detail for the first two examples. Then it will be assumed for the remainder of the slides with a brief summary at the end. Let's begin. So the first technique we're going to look at is web scans. Now, the exercise of running authenticated and non-authenticated web scans against your public and internal resources provides value alone. From my experience, most IPs aren't running in-depth targeted scans. They typically spray an attack across a subnet range with source IPs changing day to day. In this case, we can see our attackers running Nmap, Nikto, GoBuster against one of our resources. So it may be in our best interest to identify these persistent scans. Not tipping off the attacker could provide us valuable information. So what does a scan look like from our web server's perspective? We have an Apache server with Splunk installed and configured with the Apache technical add-on. Here we're looking at Apache access logs, doing a stats count by HTTP user agent. We can see based off of our scans that they generated about 6,100 unique user agent strings. So now we're going to continue with the process of identifying interesting fields, values, making sure that they're SIM compliant, data model accelerated. And our search starts to look something like this. Now we can search against our web data model for our SIM compliant fields, source, dest, HTTP user agent. We can still filter on search strings like Nikto, which when we do, now we can see we only have 6 unique HTTP user agent strings. So should SQL map, Nikto, Nmap be scanning our network? Should we block these user agent strings at our WAF? What we are going to do is start to build our dashboard panels for our detection scenarios. And we'll do that by saving this report as a dashboard panel. And now we've created our threat hunting and security analysis dashboard with our first HTTPS user agents panel. Our final step is to apply tokens to our search. In this example, we're adding the token IP to the field web.source. This is going to allow us to filter this panel by the IOC IP address. We'll add other tokens to the search for FQDN, user agent, and again, allowing us to filter this panel by those particular IOCs. We'll apply these tokens to all the relevant detection scenarios that we'll go through in hopes to automate that tier 1 SOC analysis. Next up, we'll look at brute force. Our attacker found web authentication on our page and decided to run a brute force attack against our site. This technique is a great opportunity to test your password policy enforcement, looking for timeouts, lockouts, CAPTCHA, MFA, etc. So what does a brute force look like to our web server? Now this is a scheduled search that runs every minute, looking at the last minute of our Apache access logs. And this is just going to tell us when our source IP exceeds the count of 100. Now, this is not a good way to detect brute force attempts. So what we're going to do is go through that implied process, identifying fields and values, determining authentication success and failures. Probably not found in the Apache logs, probably on the web application logs or authentication logs themselves if it's integrated with AD. And once you identify those logs, normalize them, make them SIM compliant, data model accelerated, our search will start to look something like this. Now we're running this against our authentication data model. We've identified and are filtering on action equals failure, and our logic is where that count exceeds 10. Now, this can be a scheduled search, looking at the last few seconds, minute, hour, just telling us when 10 authentication failed attempts occurred from any source type that is feeding this authentication data model. In our final step, we're going to be adding our tokens to the relevant IOC's IP and FQDN, which now allows us to filter this panel based on those IOCs. The result of the search is we can see the offending IP looks like it's attempted to brute force a number of internal resources. We'll start to pick up the pace with these. The defensive process of identifying SIM compliance, data model acceleration is going to be implied moving forward. So next up is exploiting public-facing application. The attacker found our website, found that it has a SQL injection vulnerability. They used SQL map to dump database contents. They were able to get file stager upload capabilities, in which they uploaded and executed a piece of malware on the system. This triggered some alerts. We can see some potential SQL injection attempts from our IDS. Our UTM gives us a signature, file name, the path of the uploader. And finally, our AV gives us some additional context like the user that executed that particular payload, the path, and the hash so that we can look it up. Now we're going to test visibility into command execution. Once an attacker is on the network, they need to perform some tasks, escalate privileges, maintain persistence, and search on the network for the sensitive data that they came for. Now they're going to accomplish this a number of ways by living off the LAN with Windows CLI, PowerShell, WMI. In this example, the attacker is using this powerup.ps1 script to do local enumeration of the machine. Attackers may also use community tools like Metasploit, Empire, or roll with something custom. In this search, we're going to take a look at our endpoint processes data model. We're going to filter by our SIM fields, user, processes. Now we're also going to look at this command line data model. This is the custom data model that we created to parse and accelerate PowerShell commands. Now we're specifying our SIM fields, user, path, command, and finally we're going to append these two searches together so that we can see Windows command line and PowerShell interaction within the same report. Now here's our output. We see our sysmon logs from endpoint processes, which records all of our Windows commands, whoami, ipconfig, etc. And then within a minute of the last Windows command, we can see our attacker pivot to PowerShell. With script block logging enabled, we're able to see which scripts were executed as well as some of the commands inside of those scripts. Next up is credential dumping. And there's a number of ways to accomplish this. In memory, there's PowerShell frameworks available, native tools, community tools like FGDump, PWDump, etc. I've included a link on the slide for an article that goes over all of these techniques and more. It's a great resource. So here in the slide, we see our attacker is using the invoke DC sync PowerShell script, and they've managed to dump hashes from our domain controller. We're going to look at our PowerShell logs by that custom command line data model. This is going to tell us what scripts were executed by which user. And then we see at the bottom our AV also flagged a number of the credential dumping tools. It looks like a few were deferred and are going to require some more investigation. If PowerShell transcript logging is enabled, we're able to see the output from every PowerShell command as it was displayed to the user. Now at the top, we see a stanza from our inputs.conf monitoring the directory that we specified for our transcript logs. Because transcripts aren't parsed as well as some other sources, we do have to run keyword searches. So here we're looking for DC sync or hash, which returns the output from DC sync, confirming that the attacker has access to these hashes. Next, we'll look at pass the hash. Our attacker used the hashes that they dumped in the last example to authenticate as the domain administrator. Here we can see they're using WinExe, executing the command whoami. It's successfully passed via NTLM, and it responds, essentially, you are the domain administrator. We also see that our AV flagged on the remote executable that WinExe created to execute those remote commands. The search that we have here, I believe, is from ES, or the content update, which detects potential pass the hash attacks. It's looking at win event logs, error code 4624, 4625, success or failure, log on via NTLM. It's looking for log on type 3, network log on. It's filtering out the account name, anonymous log on, and it's looking for a key length of 0. Now this alert, its urgency is set to low, and you may find that this is typical behavior on your network. Now when this attack was issued, we also received an alert via our IDS for WinExe over SMB. Now if PowerShell, psexec, WMI was used to create a different remote exe to run the commands, our AV or IDS should pick up those remote executables as well, which we would pull together to help us determine if pass the hash was used maliciously. In the home stretch, we're going to look at network and file access. Now our attacker has the access they need. They're going to look for the sensitive files that they came for in the first place. Here we see them using SMB map to pass the hash, and they have successfully found and downloaded sensitive files. If we enable audit object access, we can see what user accesses what network shares and from where. When file access is enabled, we can determine if they read or wrote data to those specific files. Here we see the domain admin using Notepad to interact with, write data to a file called sensitiveinfo.txt. And finally, exfiltration over DNS. Our attacker used the invoke DNS exfiltrator script to compress, encrypt, encode, and exfiltrate data over DNS. You can see that it was broken up into 6 chunks, sent over and received by our attacker. We're able to successfully decrypt and output that file. For detection, we'll take a look at our network resolution data model at the fields response and text. And our search logic is basically identifying DNS query lengths greater than 50 characters. So when the attacker ran that DNS exfil, this was the resulting output, those 6 chunks of information encoded and caught via clear text over the wire. All right, now that we've run through our scenario, this is just a review of that assume process, identifying common IOC fields, values, source types, creating the SPL, normalizing it, accelerating it, applying that search logic to our analysis dashboards, and this is all in the hopes of automating the SOC Tier 1 analysis. This is going to be a summary of the attack scenario we went over during the presentation. Now, based off of the first alert that came in from our UTM, we knew that the attacker had exploited our web server, uploaded a payload with a file stager. That information is provided in the alert. We also see information about the offending IP address, signature, etc. So the first thing we're going to do is filter based off of that offending IP address. We'll specify our time range for searching. By default, we'll just say the last 24 hours. And now we're going to search that IOC against all of our detection scenarios. We can see that the IP address flagged some other alerts via our firewall and UTM. We can see a number of user agent strings that it attempted, Dirbuster as an example, and some brute force attempts against internal resources, which is interesting. We see a number of IDS alerts against our web server and another internal resource for possible lateral movement. We see some network shares accessed by the domain administrator. You can see what directories were read, and then we can also see that they exfiltrated data out via DNS. The next thing we want to search is the file name. We have that IOC from our alert, so we'll search explorer.exe. Now this isn't going to populate all of our searches because it's not relevant to all of them. So we can see explorer.exe in our UTM logs. If we scroll down, we saw an AV alert. We see additional user context, the file path of that malware, the file hash to look up, some sysmon commands involving explorer.exe. And then we can also see some file access from the administrator using that file. Also see additional context data read from a particular directory. Now lastly, the additional piece of information that we have is the username. Now we're going to search this case closed user against our detection scenarios. We can see based off our AV analysis, this user flagged a number of different payloads, vault credential, cache dump, etc. We see some commands that user executed interacting with sensitive info, a netcat command, etc. And then we also have our PowerShell commands. We can see the scripts that they executed as well as some of the commands contained within those scripts. So this is just an overview of one alert that could be used to automate a number of different searches. And this is the information that we would provide to the analyst in a ticket to automate that SOC Tier 1 analysis. So now that we've completed our exercise, we want to ask some questions. Did we identify gaps in visibility? Do we have to deploy compensating controls? Or can we configure additional logging? Once we make those adjustments, it's going to be a rinse repeat process, referencing the attack frameworks, testing new techniques, retesting old techniques, identifying that visibility, and again, rinse repeat. That concludes our presentation. I hope it's given you some ideas of how to configure your Splunk environment for threat hunting and security analysis. This is one way to do things, by no means the way. So if you have any questions or experiences to add, we'll provide contact information so that we can chat further.